My family has one sacred tradition, but we only do it a few times a year. My wife and I will get our kids together, put them in the car, go on a road trip. It might be to a lake or to a farm. But the thing which everybody in that car is the most excited about is stopping at In-N-Out Burger. Some of you may have relate to this particular ritual. It's something that is, I think, common to many people on the West Coast, where In-N-Out is in a category of its own. It's gotten to out of control proportions in our family, though. Last summer, I dared to suggest somewhere between Sacramento and the Sierras that we try shish kebab. And I am not exaggerating. They would have pushed me out of the driver's seat at 70 miles an hour had I not relented. But the thing about In-N-Out Burger is that it captures people's imagination. People who would never set foot in a fast food restaurant, people like superstar chef Thomas Keller, will actually go hundreds of miles out of their way to get an In-N-Out Burger. Why is this? What is behind the cult of this seemingly innocuous fast food chain? Well, for one thing, there's something about In-N-Out Burger which is like stepping back in time. When you go to In-N-Out Burger, you don't have to worry about pink slime in your burger. You can be sure that the French fries are made from fresh potatoes. And the question is, why is this the case? Why is it that when we go there, we can buy a burger for $3, under $3, a whole meal for $5? Why is it that in an era where fast food has become synonymous with unhealthy food and McJobs, that In-N-Out Burger is celebrated for incredible food quality, all the way through from the creation of its freshly made buns to its fresh potatoes to the meat, which is as fresh as you could find it anywhere if you were making them at home. And the answer, well, before I go there, the thing about In-N-Out Burger is that it's not like it hasn't changed at all. It started years ago in 1948 with one store. Today it has over 250. And yet, so much about it has resisted the kind of fierce change that has rolled around us in the last 70 years. At first glance, this might seem like a triumph of good planning. But in actual fact, when we look at it closely, what becomes clear is that this is actually a serendipity story, but not one that looks like most serendipity stories we think of. Let's start with the basics. When Harry Snyder started the business, he had no desire to grow it. He was going to start a little family shop for him and his wife and a few employees. His idea was that he would hire a few people, they would learn the skills of running a business, and then they would go off and start their own businesses. What ended up happening was something very different. His employees didn't want to leave. They were attracted to his fierce commitment to quality. Now for him, quality wasn't just a buzzword. It was sort of like Steve Jobs and design. Like Steve Jobs famously thought about design all the way down to the circuit boards. Even if you weren't looking at it, it was still important. Even if customers weren't ever seeing it, he still cared that that circuit board was designed properly. The same thing is true for Harry Snyder. He cared that where every aspect of that burger, every aspect of that experience was high quality. So when his employees came to him and said, "We don't want to leave," and he said, "I don't have any jobs for you," part of his commitment to quality became creating new restaurants. The next thing that happened in the evolution of In-N-Out Burger is just as interesting. They had a commitment to real estate, to making sure that they controlled the real estate that they were on. So they always bought the land that their stores were on, but they could only afford land out in the suburbs. But this led to a very interesting consequence, which was that people had to drive miles out of their way to get an In-N-Out Burger. And what did this do? This created scarcity and this cult devotion. The fact that they had to drive so many miles led to this desirability that they never could have planned for. The third thing was an outgrowth of that, which we can call the cold fries phenomenon. People, because they were driving miles away, ended up having cold food by the time they got home. This was not quality in the eyes of In-N-Out Burger, which meant they had to actually break their previous rule about owning their real estate and lease real estate on the inner city so that they could avoid this new quality problem. So over and over again, we see this commitment to these overriding goals leading to stumbling on these unexpected outcomes that were only possible because of that commitment. Put differently, the change they needed to make along the way was paradoxically only possible because of this single-minded commitment. So I spent the last year or so researching the idea of serendipity and writing a book about it called Get Lucky. Our idea was that, well, we know in science and in the arts that serendipity is incredibly important, right? It may be one of the most important ways that we discover things that we didn't know existed. But in business, we're actually quite hostile to it because we're committed to planning and predictability. So we set out to unmask this mystical concept of serendipity. And we've framed it like this, that we can actually increase the presence of serendipity by increasing the role of chance in our businesses and in our lives, by developing the mindset to connect things that are not obviously connected, and by creating the ability to take action on those serendipitous discoveries. What we have found is one of the key skills of serendipity is this ability to take a different path than the one intended. We call this divergence, okay? And so if you are looking for one thing and you find another, which is the definition of serendipity, being able to take that road that you stumbled on is all important. And here in the Bay Area, we think of ourselves as very good at this, right? We think of ourselves as being able to see patterns before anybody else can, start businesses around them, and maybe pivot if that idea doesn't pan out exactly. But we have to ask ourselves if we're maybe too good at divergence, if we actually are so good at creating possibilities and taking the unexpected option that we've actually turned divergence into distractibility, if we've actually made commitment and patience bad words. So what's interesting about divergence is that we associate them with these big aha moments. These, like for instance, when 3M famously, while looking for a strong glue, a strong adhesive, they stumbled on a very weak adhesive and they created the Post-it note. The literature is studded with all kinds of stories like this about these big aha moments. But with commitment, it looks a lot different. Commitment reminds us of Cortez, the story of Cortez, and how when he landed in Mexico, he famously, but probably erroneously, burned his ships. And he burned his ships so that people, the 800 men on his ships, couldn't go back. They couldn't abandon the adventure they were on. They were committed to this path. And so what happened when he burned the ships and removed the possibility of going backwards is he forced his men to look for a chance where it fell in front of them. So we can use this as the idea in our head about how commitment plays out, what it means to be committed. It actually removes possibilities. It forces us to say no to things. So the question is, what is commitment in our own business? We all have missions and values and taglines. But commitment, if it means anything, means actually programming the automatic no. Like In-N-Out, automatically said no when Carl, from Carl's Jr., came to hire Harry Snyder, the founder, and told him that he should invest in more rapid growth, in cheaper ingredients, in lower cost employees. Harry said no, because that did not align with his commitment. Commitment works for the following three reasons. It means having a point of view that's so strong that it actually transforms the world around us. It changes how people think about it. It changes how our coworkers or colleagues actually think about what's possible. If it's strong commitment, they can't think any differently. And finally, it allows us to run into things that were already on that path. And so the serendipity is the result of meaningful action. There's lots of things we can do to increase the quantity of chance in our lives, but commitment actually increases the quality of it. So there's a scientific reason why commitment actually makes such a big difference and why it's so important. It's a concept called decision fatigue. So there's a mountain of evidence now that shows that we actually don't have an unlimited supply of willpower. It actually gets used up throughout the day. The more decisions we make, the harder it is for us to make more decisions. Unfortunately, we don't have a little meter, a little fuel meter, which says that we're running out. So it's a terrible situation that we are worse and worse at making decisions throughout the day, and we have no way of knowing it. But commitment, interestingly, helps us solve this problem. It helps us solve the problem because it tells us what we have to say no to. It actually reduces the total number of options in our lives. So divergence explodes the number of options, the number of new possibilities. And without commitment, it leads to decision fatigue. And it may be worse than not being good at divergence in some cases. But divergence paired with commitment is a magical combination. This is where we have the possibility for making serendipity an organizational skill. Now, commitment has two parts to it. One part is meaningful purpose. Meaningful purpose is not just having a vision. It's actually the reason we do what we do. It's what we use to know what to say no to. And so if we're working on our own meaningful purpose, the litmus test, it's a very clear litmus test. What does this lead me to say no to? It's very practical. The other half of commitment is just as important. It's called stick-to-itness. Stick-to-itness is actually saying the no. It's not enough to know what you should be saying no to. You actually have to do it. And in other words, you have to burn your ships. So we see this in many companies today that have learned to say no. We see this with Twitter, who has been criticized for not becoming more like Facebook with lots and lots of features. They've been committed to simplicity and to not cluttering up their activity stream. We've seen this with TED, who said no to closing off all of its content, instead opening it up and sharing it with the world, including with things like TEDx. And we've seen it with things like Pinterest, which for many months struggled over its business and remained committed to its business model even though the market seemed to be saying no. But what if we haven't actually dropped the anchor on commitment? Many companies today may once have had commitment but have lost it. Apple famously had its commitment butchered by a series of desperate management moves, but Steve Jobs was able to come in and return them to its commitments. We can do the same thing if we've lost our way. But in other cases, we find that companies started and gained some success with never having a sense of commitment, never having a meaningful purpose. They may be very financially successful, but now we're struggling today without a mooring in a sea of change. So I want to tell you a story about a company called Interface, which 20 years ago was in just this situation. Very successful, a textile manufacturer, which, if you know anything about textile manufacturing, one of the most polluting industries in the world. Chemicals, waste, shipping. And its founder and CEO, Ray Anderson, decided through a series of serendipitous events to draw the line, say no more. We're going to reinvent the textile manufacturing industry such that we're going to show the world that we can have zero net impact on the environment. But not just that, we're also going to be the most profitable company in our space. So he declared this to his employees, and he declared this to the market. They were a publicly traded company. So don't tell me you can't do this as a publicly traded company. He did it. And he burned his ships because there was no turning back from this. He said, we are going, by 2020, we're going to have net zero impact on the environment. And he told this to his teams. The first team to reach the mandate, to hear the mandate, was the design team, who Ray asked to go and come up with a whole new series of designs inspired by nature, or organic nature patterns. So the design leader sent his team out into the forests. And out in the forests, They expected to come back with patterns of leaves and ferns. And instead, something magical happened. What happened was that they squinted, and they noticed that all these leaves and all these stones in the rivers, they were random patterns or seemingly random patterns, but they came together to create completely coherent patterns. And it got them thinking, what if we've been thinking about carpets all wrong? What if the cookie cutter sameness of our carpet tiles, what if that's the wrong way about it? What if we could take carpet materials, waste matter, and combine them in carpet tiles that are all different, every single one of them different, and every single one of them using 100% recycled materials? What kind of benefits would we get from this? Well, besides being able to use up all of those all that waste material, it allowed the home builders to install these in a fraction of the time because they didn't need to put them in a particular order. It created a beautiful mosaic experience on the floors. And most importantly, it allowed them to reach their core commitment of hitting their net impact on the environment. So by going from this commitment, it changed the way that these teams saw the world around them and the way they saw their mandates. And they were able, for the first time, to stumble on something that was amazing on its own terms, but particularly special because of the commitment they had made as a company. So I want to wrap up by bringing this back around to this idea of decision fatigue. Like, one of the few things that works to combat decision fatigue is being able to say no to things. And the thing that allows you to say no to things more than any other are habits, the right habits. Saying no is an example of a habit. And all the companies we've talked about have mastered the art of saying no. Having patience, the patience to not be thinking in terms of the immediate response from a market, from a customer, from your employees, is another kind of habit which allows you to retain that commitment. And then focusing on controlling the controllables. Focusing on engaging those parts of your world which you can have direct impact, and admitting you can't control so much of it. That is where serendipity can bloom, given that space. So I invite you to find your space to allow serendipity to bloom, because that is the magic which is behind, I think, all the companies and organizations and people we admire most. Thank you for listening.